Hello and welcome to another Wargaming Coven video. Today we're actually looking at something a bit different. We'll look at first in hopefully a series of Commander slash EDH, however you want to call it, and Magic the Gathering decks. So today we're looking at a deck I built around somebody called Thelon of Havenwood. He's actually from the Time Spiral block, and I came across him quite randomly in the shop, just digging through a mixed singles box, and he looked quite interesting. He uses Golgari colours, that's green and black if you're not familiar. He's a elf druid, and as you can see on screen, he has a nice tribal ability that links with various fungus cards. So fungus cards typically generate spore counters each turn, and he can essentially treat those as +1/+1 counters. So all of your creatures, or all of your fungus creatures I should say, get +1/+1 counter each turn, essentially, as long as Thelon is alive. And that's an important aspect we'll come into later. He can also remove dead fungi cards from the graveyards to put counters in addition to the ones they would create themselves. So this deck focuses around having quite a lot of fungus creatures in the deck, because if you don't have them in play, you can't make use of his abilities. It really is sort of, that's all he is there for. He's a support piece. And a lot of the majority of the fungus creatures can produce Saproling tokens using their spore counters. So we have sort of sub-theme of generating lots of 1/1 Saprolings, and these can be used to feed the Devour creatures that we also have in this deck, which are predominantly the only non-fungus creatures that we have here. In the event of a board wipe, because he can utilize graveyard, as long as there isn't much graveyard hate out there, you can actually recover quite quickly. And he's quite a cheap casting cost himself, so he doesn't cost a lot to bring back. And with the majority of the fungus creatures creating their own spore tokens anyway, you'll find your board states tends to ramp up quite quickly. So without further ado, let's move on to the first of the cards. The first things we're going to look at are these core cards that help support spore counter generation. So it really increases them a lot faster. So from fairly recently, we've got Winding Constrictor, which adds another token on each time. Fungal Bloom is quite nice. It's an enchantment that lets you, without having to tap it, generate an additional spore counter. It's only on a single fungus, but you can do it multiple times. It fits in relatively well with the mana base. And then we have Spore Sower Thalid, which is actually the first of the creatures, the fungus creatures that we'll see. What's quite nice about this is that it actually generates out additional spore counters for all your other fungi you have on the board. So the majority of your fungi, obviously not this one because he doesn't generate any for himself beyond this ability, will then be getting +2/+2 every turn. It sort of really builds up. And he's on a 4/4 body, so he's reasonably hard to remove. Moving forward, we have the first of the two expensive cards in the deck, Doubling Season. This is nice because it works with all tokens. So with the Devour creatures that you'll see later on, they are generating actual +1/+1 tokens. And with the fungus creatures, we're generating spore counters. So this really ramps up both those aspects. It's not hugely expensive to get in, particularly for a commander deck. So that's quite a core piece. And then the final other thing we have here is the Illusionist Bracers. So for anyone not familiar, it's a piece of equipment, and it essentially doubles an activated ability that isn't a mana ability. So what's nice about this is you can put it on Thelon himself. So then every time you exile a fungus from your graveyard, you're getting 2 spore counters on each of your fungi, which grows quite quickly. But also, although the equip cost is high at 3, it's very useful to stick it on a lot of your fungi creatures, because in addition to just having the spore counters to either make them larger or create sapling tokens, which is a fairly common theme, many of them have their own abilities you can trigger off of that. So that can be quite a useful thing to bounce it around to those creatures and get a lot more value out of those as well. Another aspect that we have a little small collection of cards for is the Proliferate mechanic. So this essentially lets you choose any number of permanents in play and add an additional counter that they already have on them. So you'll see this in things like Infect decks, stuff like that. We use it here because it lets us add more spore counters without having to, lose anything from our graveyard in the process. And it also allows us to increase our +1/+1 counters. A couple of these here, you'll see also let us stick -1/-1 counters and things. The cheapest one here, Contagion Clasp, it only puts a -1/-1 on a single enemy creature, but the Contagion engine can do a lot of damage when it hits all the creatures they have. So as well as boosting your own guys, you're potentially draining a player who you won't be terribly popular with in the commander game, admittedly, draining their creatures down quite rapidly. In the case of the Plague Maw Beasts, it has the cost of sacrificing a creature. That really isn't a problem for us because we will have a lot of saplings in play, and you can also use your spore tokens, spore counters I should say, to create saplings. So generally it works out at about 3 spore counters creates a sapling. So you use 3 spore counters, create a sapling, sacrifice it and proliferate with this guy, And as long as you have at least 3 creatures in play, you're not losing out from that deal. Moving forward, before we actually get onto the different fungus creatures that we're going to be using, the first key thing here is protection for your commander. Now, a lot of commanders, it's good to, give them hexproof and various things to keep their abilities in play, but it is absolutely crucial with Thelon and with this deck, because if he isn't protected, you cannot reliably do anything with your fungus creatures, because the moment he's gone, those spore counters go back to just essentially not buffing the power or toughness of your creatures. So a single kill spell, your army becomes neutered, and then they can be completely wiped out, whether you're attacking and they just destroy with blockers, or whether you're blocking. So you'll see there's a lot of protection cards in here for the commander, disproportionately so for a commander deck, but it really is that important. You need to make sure that you have one either in your opening hand or within the first few turns. Here you'll see some of the cheapest ones we have. Anything they give beyond hexproof or shroud is a bonus, and they all generally do something beyond that. So if you already have one in play, they're not dead cards, you can stick them on your other creatures. Lightning Greaves are great, they have an equip cost of 0. Swiftfoot Boots aren't much different, only have an equip cost of 1. Aspect of Mongoose as an enchantment is quite a nice card. When it goes into the graveyard, so if the creature dies somehow, like a board wipe or something, it goes back to your hand. You can't move it around like the equipment, but it is nice and cheap. Apart from Lightning Greaves, it's the cheapest thing in this deck for protection. So that is quite a nice card. We're starting to get on this slide to slightly more expensive cards, but they come with other benefits. Champion's Helm gives +2/+2. That is nice. In reality, Thelon, and you don't really want to be attacking with him, because then, aside from the hexproof, whether you're blocking or attacking, you're opening him up to combat tricks that can kill him. But it has a nice cheap equip cost. Much the same with Darksteel Plate, and also Darksteel Plate works really well on some of your creatures. Mark of Avacyn, you can see the equip cost is starting to creep up here, but it has a relatively cheap ability to play it in. And finally, the last 3 options we have here, Shield of Kaldra is nice in that it is in itself indestructible. It is a later play. You're probably not going to be using that as a first choice. That's more coming in maybe if you've had a few board wipes, you've had some artifact destruction. A bit later in the game, that's the card you want. Asceticism is a fantastic card. It gives you across the board hexproof, and it lets you regenerate anything. Doesn't have to be a green creature, can be any creature you have on the board. When this comes into play, you have to watch your mana and things. With Thelon in particular, it's not necessarily the best thing for protecting him, but it has great functionality on a wider scope. And Heroic Intervention, while it's a one-use instant, giving everything you have, hexproof and indestructible, can get you out of quite a few binds, and it is dirt cheap for what it does. You can use it to avoid kill spells, you can use it to avoid the majority of board wipes that are out there. You can use it just in general combat situations, when you're blocking, when you're attacking, anything like this. It really is a fantastically useful card, and the one-use thing compared to some of these other issues hurts it, but it has so much scope, and crucially can help you in so many different situations that perhaps some of the others. Shield of Kaldra is great, it's nice, can't be destroyed itself, it can be exiled, but the mana cost is harsh, whereas Heroic Intervention, you can really use that early game to, if you're starting to ramp up much faster than the other players and you're starting to get a bit of political hatred coming your way, Heroic Intervention can be your best friend. Now, moving on to the first of the fungi, the important cards, the reason you're here to see this deck, and what makes it interesting. The great thing about Thelon, loads of the fungi have awesome artwork. You're looking at some things, I think, you're looking at a lot of cards from Fallen Empires, and a lot of cards from Time Spiral, and there's some weird, funky, bizarre stuff. You're going to get an excuse to use great card art. So this first batch of fungi we're going to look at have quite handy abilities built into them. So this is where we're talking about using spore counters for things that are beyond merely making creatures big and creating Saproling. Spore Flower is nice in that it is a reusable fog, and that is always something that is useful to have. Doesn't deal with non-combat damage, so burn spells and all that stuff will still hurt you, but fog on a stick, and you don't have to jump through a ton of hoops to do it. It's going to create a spore counter every turn, So it's essentially a fog every 3 turns, but as you'll see, with the counter support we had earlier, you can fairly early to mid-game have that as a reliable, reusable fog whenever you want it. And it's very useful for the political games as well, you know, throwing favors certain people's ways, helping them out. For a 2-mana creature, it's deceptively useful when combined with Thelon and some of these other support aids. Savage Salad is handy in that in a bind, you can use your Saplings to regenerate fungus. You don't have to use the Spore counters off of him to make that Sapling. We've got a lot of that later on. It's more expensive, but later game, being able to regenerate half your board is fairly good. Now, Utopia Mycon is your mana fixer. Granted, if you were using 3 Spore counters to create 1 mana, that isn't the best benefit ratio. You know, early game, that will help edge you forwards. It'll help get something like your Asceticism or the Savage Salad in. But later game, we're really looking at getting our Saplings from other sources, and this can really help, especially with some of the Devour creatures or some of the certain things with variable mana costs that can really help speed up, and things like the regeneration ability on Asceticism, putting some of those more expensive equipments into place and so on. Psychotrope Thallid is really nice, gives you card draw, so between the two of these, bearing in mind that they're actually quite cheap mana cost, you can replace your hand later on quite easily. You can play something that'll give you a handful of Saplings. Between the Mycon Thallid, you can regenerate your hand and refill it quite nicely, which is something that perhaps green doesn't always do as well, but with this you can start to compete with the blue player a little bit, which is kind of nice. And finally, our last set of fungi that have abilities. These are a bit more combat focused. The Vita Spore gives you the ability to give haste to things through sacrificing your sapling. You don't really want to use that with your fungi because when they come into play, they're weak in comparison to other stuff. Where you're using that is your Devour creatures. Your Devour creature comes in, it's really big because you've eaten a whole bunch of saplings, made it really chunky, and you want to attack with him that turn because it, you know, keeps him safe from your sorceries and things that people could target them, or, you know, enchantments that'll exile them and so on. Deathspore Thallid for 2 mana can be a lifesaver. You can get rid of some of those really nasty indestructibles because it's reusable. You don't have to taps to it. You can essentially sacrifice any number of saplings, get rid of 5 of them. You can kill indestructible gods. You can take out simple utility pieces, little things that are, you know, pinging off some of your weaker saplings, you know, taps do a damage, that kind of thing. That can get rid of those. It's again one of those surprisingly effective cards in this deck when you have a large number of saplings to burn. And finally, Mold Shambler simply has a kicker cost that can let you destroy a land, so that lets you play some neat political games there. Just having that threat aspect, people will know, you know, it's quite common cards, but in a lot of the online video games, they'll know there's a fungus out there that can do that. Whether you have it in your hand or not doesn't really matter. And moving on, these are our non-ability focused fungi that are in the sort of weenie end, you know, 1-2 mana, quite small. Thallid, that's quite a basic one, doesn't do anything funny, but again it ramps up quite quick. Mold Adder is quite nice because you're guaranteed to have at least somebody playing blue and black, and for a 1-turn drop that is potentially getting an additional +1/+1 beyond. Admittedly, it doesn't create its own spore counters, that is one aspect, but that's quite nice. Rot Shambler again in a multiplayer 4-player environment. Every time a creature dies, it gets +1/+1, so that generates quite quickly too. And these are the kind of creatures that you can lose early on without having too much concern about them, and then later use them to spread spore counters amongst your more useful fungi. Thallid Shell Dweller, a lot of people can be a little down on defender creatures outside of some sort of skew builds. Use things like, you know, Vent Shambler and the whatever the homunculus is that mills people. But this guy, for 2 mana, 5 toughness, he will live through a lot of early game stuff, and he's generating spore counts on himself, so fairly soon you get a pretty large blocker there, and to get him out early can really dissuade some of the attacks coming your way, especially as people start to see spore counters build up and it starts to get a bit, you know, aggressive. And finally, we see the first here of the changelings. Now, the changeling rule counts regardless of where the creature is. It can be in your graveyard, it can be in your hand, doesn't matter. It counts as all creature types. It's not restricted to just when that creature is in play. So all of the shapeshifters which feature the changeling rule, which are in the Lorwing block. They all count as fungi too. You'll see this in a number of tribal decks where people will mix these in to bolster up some of the weaknesses of the tribe by itself. Skeletal Changeling doesn't do anything particularly fancy, but it has a regeneration. Moving forward, we're starting to see sort of mid-range fungi. Don't necessarily do anything special, but a lot of them are getting new spore counters and so on. Something to keep in mind with the Changelings, they won't be making their own spore counters, but with things like the Thelon's own ability, they can pick up the spore counters that way. And then when you throw in things like the doubling season, they'll generate them quite quickly, or proliferate and so on. So Woodland Changelings, basic 2/2. Thorn Thallid is quite nice. It gives you the ability to ping people. It's an expensive way to ping people, but if you don't have the Death Spore Thallid from earlier, that can be a way just to pick off annoying creatures that have abilities that are causing you problems. And one of the other nice things, I think this is a Fallen Empires one, you'll find a lot of the cards, commons and things, they have multiple art variants. So you can actually pick which one you think looks nice. Thallid Devourer, the saplings can be used to boost him up. It can be useful in terms of playing blocker games with people, but again, it's fairly simple. Thallid Germinator does the same thing, but it allows you to expand the scope, ostensibly. Moonglove Changeling is quite handy as a Death Touch source. Although we're playing with black and green, there isn't really any Death Touch in the fungi. Generally speaking, against most decks, you don't need the Death Touch because your stuff is ramping up quite quickly, and you will tend to be in a situation where you have the higher power a lot of the time. Ghostly Changeling can buff himself at an expensive cost. Undergrowth Scavenger, in a 4-player game, deceptively good card. It's not quite a Tarmogoyf. It has a higher mana cost, but then you're not playing Modern. It comes in with a fair number of +1/+1 counts on it, which can also benefit of things like doubling season and so on. And then we move on to the slightly larger fungi. Now, something you'll find, there aren't that many fungi creatures that are strong at a base level. You're really relying on those counters. Game Troll Changeling offers us a relatively cheap trample source. That can be very useful as the counters build up. Cairn Wanderer is a gold star in that this deck tends to be fairly vulnerable to flying. There isn't a whole lot of flying defense here. Generally speaking, when dealing with a flying deck, this deck gets around that with a couple of cards, one of which is Cairn Wanderer, but primarily having big stuff on the ground that is flexible and adaptable, and keeping the emphasis and the movement on that aspect, as opposed to trying to sit back and weather things out. The Cairn Wanderer has the capability to pick up a lot of these rules and abilities, including crucially flying, that if somebody has a lot of flying creatures in deck, you'll very soon have one in the graveyard. That really helps bolster up some of the weaknesses in this deck. And finally on this page we've got Feral Thallid. Again, it has the ability to regenerate at a cost. One of the nice things about the spore counters is that sometimes these abilities aren't ideal. They cost you a certain amount of resource that you've built up to do so, but it gives you flexibility. And then if you lose a fungus, it's not the end of the world, because through the ability, unlike Scavenge, which would take the power of a creature and stick it on one creature you have in play, this then spreads it out amongst the board, so you're not really putting too many eggs in one basket. And something else you'll notice, all of these abilities to do with taking spore counters off are all activated abilities, so you get the benefit of illusionist bracers there in terms of being able to double what you get from your spore counter usage. Chameleon Colossus has protection from black, which is quite nice, but importantly it has the capability to double its power. It costs a little bit of mana to do that, but as you can see again, as the spore counters build up, that gets a better and better, more powerful ability. And Fungal Behemoth can potentially come in, depending on how many Devour creatures you've got in play. You might not even need to use the Suspend ability, because they can build up quite quickly from eating the saplings. Now we're starting to get into the sapling creation beyond merely using our spore counters. What you've seen so far are our core fungus creatures. They're a lot of the ones that we are using with Thelon's ability. Now we're moving into the second aspect, which is sort of using the saplings we get from them and from other cards to feed the small number of Devour creatures we have. We don't have too many, but there isn't much point to be drawing them early on. They're more your game finishers and so forth. Here we have 2 more fungus creatures which also fall into this category. Spore Mound allows you to create a sapling with every land you play. It's not going to win you the game, but it's a nice handy ability to have in terms of generating those numbers to get to the critical mass you need. Boroloth Ancient is handy in that it not only does it generate its own spore counters and so on, but it makes the creation of saplings from all your other creatures cheaper because you only then need 2 spore counters as opposed to the standard 3 to make a simple sapling. Combine that with Illusionist Bracers, 2 spore counters will then get you 2 saplings. Here we have some spells that are great ways to very rapidly create a lot of saplings. And Fungal Sprouting and Sapling Symbiosis kind of cover 2 different bases. Fungal Sprouting, you actually want, your fungus creatures to have quite a lot of spore counters on them because you generate then 1 sapling for each power. Whereas Sapling Symbiosis essentially creates 1 for each creature you have. So in that instance, sometimes you want to drain off as much of the spore counters as you want, because then you're gaining a sapling for each of those, and in addition a sapling for each of your fungi. So this has the potential, you can 1 minute be going quite, have a small number of quite strong creatures, and then suddenly you can go very wide. So it has the ability to adapt to, large scale token decks. If you suddenly find, your health's quite low and you need a large number of blockers, you can adapt that way. And these aren't terribly expensive cards, but you can quite regularly be getting something like 6-7 saplings out of them. Even just as a precursor to playing a Devour creature, it can be very useful. Sprout Storm although it's expensive with the buyback cost of 3, it has Convoke. So all those saplings that you already have suddenly become your mana sources. It's not that difficult at any stage in the game to be able to create 3 saplings off of the fungi you have. And then you can use those to play this and buy it back, and so on. And each time you create those saplings, they also can then be used to convoke it again if you've bought it back. So if you get this kind of mid-game, you can get a lot of value out of it, which is quite useful. And finally, we have the cards that give you the ability to create saplings without having to be essentially a one-use thing. So Necrogenesis will let you clear out people's graveyards, doesn't have to be your own. Costs you 2 mana for each sapling. Again, compared to some of the cost of building it up with spore counters, that's not so bad. Jade Mage does the same for 3, but doesn't have any graveyard requirement. Admittedly, in Commander, you're likely to not have a problem pulling creatures out of graveyards, but it's nice to have that there. Namata's at the more expensive end. She costs 3 mana, just like the Jade Mage, to create a sapling, but has the capacity to sacrifice sapling and buff all other saplings from the 1 sacrifice. So where this is quite handy is that you can attack with suddenly a whole bunch of 1/1s, and then after people declare their blockers, you come back and say, oh, well, I'm going to take some spore counters off of my fungi, create a few saplings, and then suddenly each one of those that dies gives you +1/+1. So it's very easy to suddenly get +3/+3 or +4/+4 on all of your attacking creatures. So that kind of offsets the high cost that she has. It's not something you want to see early game, but it is something that can throw a surprise, because it's not a card that necessarily a lot of people are familiar with. It can throw a surprise later in game and give you another way to kind of outmaneuver and sort of finish off an unwary opponent. And, sorry, the last 2 cards, Golgari Germination. It's not going to produce you saplings at a huge rate. It does give you a little bit of comeback. Basically, every time a creature dies, you get a sapling token from it. It doesn't have to be your creature. It does have to be a non-token creature, so you can't play funny shenanigans with your own saplings. It depends on how aggressive the other players are, how many control decks you have, how much usage you get out of this. But in those situations where there's a lot of aggro decks and you need some blockers at a short notice, it can be quite useful. And finally, we have Thelonite Hermit. At its base cost of 4 mana, it's not really worth playing. It doesn't synergize with anything beyond giving saplings +1/+1. The morph cost is expensive at 5 mana on top of the 3 that you paid to play it as a 2/2. But then you're getting 4 1/1s out of it. So with his ability, you're getting 4 2/2s plus the buff. If you take the morph cost in combination, it's 8 mana, which is way too much. But it has the nice ability to split things across turns. And when you are generating spore counters on a lot of your creatures and they're getting buffed naturally, you don't necessarily need to be keeping as much mana to augment them through other ways yourself, and so you can quite often afford to do that. Now, once you've created all these saplings, you can go wide with them, but there's a number of Devour creatures that play in quite nicely. A couple of them are fungus creatures as well. Corpsejack Menace, the first of these, essentially means that you double the number of +1/+1 counters you put on a creature, which, if you take a look at the Mycolith, 5 mana for a 4/4 with Devour 2. It's a fungus, so it'll be getting Spore counters and getting bigger that way. But if you happen to have both of these in play, that essentially becomes Devour 4, and that's +4/+4 encounters for each sapling it eats. And then it creates a whole bunch of saplings each turn based on the number of counters it has. At 5 mana, the capacity for this to blow your deck up fairly early in the game is really high. They can be used for other Devour creatures. You can use them with Utopia Mycon as mana sources. You can use them as trump blockers to allow your fungi to be more aggressive, and they're going to keep replacing themselves, so you can afford to go out there with your bigger creatures. It really opens up a lot of scope. The rest of the Devour creatures aren't fungi, but a lot of them have their own abilities. Gluttonous Slime has Flash. It's only Devour 1, but it allows you to play games with somebody thinking they can force something through. Skull Mulcher gives you the ability to draw cards for each card devoured, so you can refill your hand again quite quickly, as we saw earlier with a couple of the fungi. Marrow Chomper is up to a Devour 2 and gives you life gain. It's pretty much the only life gain we have in this deck outside of the Cairn Wanderer, and that relies on somebody having life gain in the first place. But all of these give you real scope to adapt, because you choose exactly how much, and the side effect is also that you're getting a rather large creature which can get even more counters based on the double-in season and the Corpsejack Menace. Finally, we've got Tar Fiend, which is your ability to make somebody discard a whole bunch of stuff, and the last, but certainly not least, is the Bloodspore Thrynax. This can get a bit crazy because it says when each other creature you control enters the battlefield. It's not when it's played or cast. So if you get a large number, or even just several, +1/+1 counters on Bloodspore Thrynax, all of the saplings that you create from your fungi, when they come into play, will get those buffs. And it is not uncommon to suddenly see all of your saplings coming in at 7/7, which, given the speed with which you can generate Spore counters, and the speed with which you can drain those down and use Illusionist Braces to create even more than you would normally have, that has won games for me in the past by itself. Moving on, we have the other support cards. So these are small things that don't really necessarily play into the synergy or the particular capabilities of Thelon, but work well. Vampiric Tutor is the second of our expensive cards. Between this and Dublin Season, it makes up about half the value of the deck, so you could easily replace Vampiric Tutor with any other tutor of your choice. This is primarily useful for finding those key pieces like Bloodspore Thrynax, your Mycolith Asceticism, also a card you're about to see coming up on the next slide. Lifecrafter's Bestiary, a fairly recent card, came out in Aether Revolt. I found it to be incredibly useful. Scrying every turn, really, for 3 mana, it gives you a great deal of control over your deck. And bearing in mind that most of your abilities, this is a very creature-heavy deck, most of your abilities are tied up in creatures. So you're playing a lot more creatures than an average deck, because Thelon needs a large number of fungi to be reliable with his abilities. As such, the capacity to pay a green mana whenever you play a creature and draw a card actually gives this deck real legs, because in reality, most turns you're playing a creature. And you generally, with the mana curve with most of the fungi being relatively cheap, you don't have many turns where you're stuck for mana. There isn't any mana ramp in this deck, but there's a slightly higher number of lands, and this can really get things going a lot faster than otherwise would be the case. The other support cards we have, although this is not a deck based around coat of arms and all those other cards that beef up on a tribal level because they can get a bit dull, and one of the nice things about Thelon is you're creating a tribal beef without it being those same old packs of cards. Door of Destinies is so good that it is still worth including, because simply you have 30 fungus creatures in total across this deck. So it's very quick to build up the charge counters on that, and it essentially gives +1/+1 for each charge counter on each creature of that type that you've played since playing Door of Destinies. So it produces its worth because of the need to have lots of fungus creatures to make Thelon viable. I haven't gone all out with lots of cards like that. With Door of Destinies, albeit at a slightly high-ish cost, achieves probably the best value ratio of any of those. Raking Canopy is our other answer card for flying. It does 4 damage to any creature that attacks you with flying, and it's really cheap at 3 mana. It's something that I often pull out with Vampiric Tutor if I find a very flying heavy deck them up against. In reality, if they haven't gone very heavy on flying, I tend not to focus on it with Vampiric Tutor, just because I'm keeping them focused on my threats as opposed to letting them ping me down because they're keeping their flyers back, because you're kind of overwhelming that player. That you tend to find with this deck, it's good to go after any players of that type first. And finally, Primal Vigor, a little expensive, but it works with increasing the number of tokens you get, which can increase the Saproling generation like crazy. You know, in the ideal fantastical situation, you'd be paying 2 Spore counters on Illusionist Bracers to make 2 tokens that would then create 4 Saproling tokens every time you did it. It also increases the +1/+1 counters for the Devour creatures. So it hits a couple of angles there. It hits the Saproling and the Devour sub-themes. And moving on to lands, there's not a whole lot of utility lands in here, primarily because for Thelon, you need coloured mana for his abilities. And because the early game is quite important with this deck, you don't want to be having lots of lands that come into play tapped, because you need to get those fungi out early to build up the Spore counters. If you're waiting, you're losing a lot of time, which you don't have. The 2 utility lands that this deck does include, Bojuka Bog, because you tend to have a reliance on your graveyard. Quite often, your fungi won't sit in your graveyard for long, because once they're in there, you will use Thelon's abilities. But it can be quite a nice thing to have a Bojuka Bog in there, because if you have another black player who's got a little bit of graveyard hate in their deck, it's nice to have a little bit of something to threaten them back with. And Oran Reef works incredibly useful. It can buff your Saprolings, and it can buff your fungi. We do have a few mono black creatures, but by far and large, it's going to give you a lot of benefit. Almost all your fungi are green, apart from some of the changelings. And apart from that, just 17 forests and 17 swamps. Because I've got 36 lands there, none of them produce colorless. I haven't gone for much in the way of expensive cards that give you mana fixing, because in reality, it's very rare that you get stuck with one and not the other. The deck comes in at around $200 at current prices. Half of that is tied in Doubling Season and Vampiric Tutor. So Vampiric Tutor is easily to replace with something else. Doubling Season is really the only truly expensive card in here. It's trending around 50 US at the moment, I think. There's a few cards around the $5 to $15 mark, but by and large, it's not too expensive to collect for. There's not a huge demand for fungus creatures out there. And while there are some Saproling decks, again, they're not the most popular theme, so you're not going to be paying a lot for cards like the Martyr and so on. Deck quite fun to play. Besides the somewhat potentially humorous aspect of fighting people with a whole bunch of fungus creatures and some ooze creatures and a whole bunch of tiny little Saprolings that suddenly become 7/7s. It's got a nice synergistic aspect without feeling necessarily too broken. You get to see cards from quite a few different eras. You've got some very, very early cards, and then you've got some stuff from Time Spiral, and there's a few sort of fungus or fungus-related cards that came out in more recent core sets, you know, one in 2011, one in 2012, and so on. So overall, you get quite a nice spread, and it's something that you won't necessarily see a lot of tables, and as a result, sometimes people don't necessarily know what to expect from it. And it sort of reaches this point where once you've got a couple of your utility pieces in, it hits critical mass, and suddenly, as I said before, it explodes. Suddenly you're creating a huge number of very expensive, very powerful creatures out of nowhere. And it doesn't necessarily have such deterministic build-up. The only thing is keeping Thelon alive. In reality, you've got 9 pieces of protection there. You're going to have something fairly early on. And it's not necessarily a huge problem if Thelon dies early and you lose some early fungus creatures, because you can use him to turn them into Spore counters for everything else. And by that point, they won't be so huge and so crucial to your defense that you need them. Overall, I hope you've enjoyed this first EDH tech video. We're going to be doing a bunch more over the coming months and uploading some more of the decks that I like to play with. Generally speaking, trying to focus on creatures that perhaps aren't played as commonly, because one of the great things about EDH and Commander is that you're open to such a large card pool. There's so many things out there, there's so many off-the-wall builds, and you see a much greater variety when you sit down at the table than you do in some formats like modern and also standard. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing this unusual commander. He can be bought for pennies, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.